This is Nice Work. I'm Alex Chambers. Gabriel Jenks has a new album out. It's called Lonesome, and it's a collection of songs in folk and bluegrass traditions. It's a bit of a departure. Jenks is an associate professor of music composition at the Jacobs School of Music, and the project he did before Lonesome was a combination of book, play, opera, and musical composition that involved composing from different stylistic standpoints to interrogate music theory over the past few centuries. Not a bluegrass album. So I asked him to come in and tell me how he got from one to the other. We talked about the social context of music theory in the Enlightenment and early 20th century Europe, being maybe the biggest music nerd at a music conservatory, and what working in a cow barn has to do with becoming a harpist. I started by asking how he got started in music.
Well, I guess I can't remember a time when I wasn't involved in music. From the time I can remember, I begged my parents to, let me have classical music lessons and, help me to figure this out. And
do you remember do you have a first memory of noticing classical music and what made you want it?
Well, we had kind of a large record collection in my house. And, one of my memories is that my dad would come home from his job at the local college. He was a librarian. And he would take off his work clothes and put on his sweats. And then, we'd be kind of waiting for him. And he would come out and he'd be all comfortable and kind of ready to hang out. And one of the things that we would do would be to listen to music. And I'm sure we listened to all kinds of things, but it was Bach that really stuck to me. I know we listened to Mozart in fairly significant quantities too, but it was like Bach, particularly the cantatas that I remember from that really, really early time. I just remember kind of being overwhelmed by the beauty of it. And this sensation of, the shivers that go over your skin and when you listen. And that was the earliest sensation of something kind of really beyond me that I can remember. It was kind of transcendent. And, it was like 3, 4. So I think, when something touches you that deeply at that early an age, it has kind of quite an impact. So I don't think I had much of an idea of what this would even mean for me, but I knew that was what I wanted to do. Mm-hmm. And we lived in a very rural town, which not a lot of resources per se. But there was about maybe 10 miles in another direction, a teacher of Suzuki violin. And that was kind
there you go.
Yeah,
that's
the person that was available. So that's how I started.
At that age especially.
Yeah. And I remember, it's so funny, these things that, the confluences of resources that happened to be there. But there was a luthier that lived just outside of town. And she made violins, and she was not only were they for sale, but she would rent them, and which was great when you're tiny because you're growing and you don't stay on one for very long.
Right.
But I remember my parents rented for me a quarter-sized violin.
Yeah.
And I would go for my violin lessons.
Which for people who haven't seen them are just adorable.
They look like toys.
They really look like toys. Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember similarly when I would practice and feel that I had really learned something, that sensation, I got it again. That feeling of like, okay, this is something that's bigger than me and it's incredible and it's affected me like this wave kind of thing. And I feel as though from that early stage, there was never anything else that quite touched me in that way. I mean, I was always very involved in writing stories and writing, which, I'll pick up as another thread in terms of what it is that I do, because that sort of goes side by side.
True.
And that would oftentimes do something similar for me. But I think that visceral sense of these sound waves and, how they hit me and all of that was very formative. So it was, when my violin teacher moved away, it was piano next. And, the same thing. It was just somehow this involvement was much larger than I could. It wasn't like I had a specific, I'm going to do this for this reason, and then it's this sort of performance goal or whatever. It was just like, I need to swim in this ocean somehow.
Then harp became your instrument. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, piano kind of stayed.
Okay.
Because piano is, for me at least, and I think a lot of people feel the same way, you kind of can't not have it as a composer. Like, you sort of have to have it. Mm-hmm. So, it stayed there for me. And but the harp, I can't remember exactly how old I was, somewhere in the 9 to 11 zone, probably in there. And it was a funny circumstance. My aunt is a harpist, and so that's kind of how it occurred to me, because she came through after an audition and she brought her harp, and this was apparently when I was very small. I don't even remember this. Okay. But so apparently I plucked a string, and she said to my mom, "This is a harpist." So
something about the motion of your hip finger.
Yeah, something about it. I don't know. Anyway, I got it into my head at a certain point that I was going to get myself a harp. Mm-hmm. And, my family didn't have a lot of financial resource, so it was kind of like, well, that's a whole different ballgame than renting a quarter-size violin. Like, that is that's more significant.
Yeah.
And I think also they were kind of like, okay, you've had your time with the violin, you've had your time with the piano, do you really need the harp also? Mm-hmm. So I said, yeah, absolutely I do, and I will work in the cow barn down the hill until I earn enough money to buy a harp. You don't even have to help me a little bit. So I think, I can't remember exactly, but I think I was paid somewhere between 50 cents and $1 per hour.
That is a lot of hours to get a harp.
Yeah.
Because you can't get a harp the way you get a piano. Like, someone just wants to get rid of their piano.
Yeah, no.
Harps are not abundant that way.
They are not. So anyway, I persisted for a really long time at the barn. Uh-huh. And my job was to wash the cows' udders before they were milked. But the thing is that, and I was a pretty small kid, and the cows would kick me. And so I would fall into the manure gutter.
Wow, you really wanted this.
Yeah. And so I think at a certain point, my parents were like, oh my goodness, you're so bruised up. Like, okay, maybe we'll step in here. So
right. We're going to be paying for the doctor or a harp. So.
Yeah, exactly. So I put, however $25 or whatever I had finally earned. It was probably much more than that, actually, because I think I worked there for at least a year. Okay. So whatever it was, Anyway, I put down whatever money I had, and then they paid the rest for this little lap harp. Mm. So when that came, in the fashion that had been the case for me with the violin and the piano, I very quickly picked it up and very quickly became incredibly serious. And so I think at that point they thought, okay, well, this kid clearly, that's what they want to do. Yeah. So, my hometown is 90 miles about south of Rochester, where the Eastman School of Music is in Rochester. So my parents, one or the other of them, each week came to drive me to Rochester for my music lessons. The harp was in Rochester, and then piano was in the other direction in a town called Houghton, where there was a pretty decent music school. Okay. And a pianist who had been, a DMA student at Eastman taught there. Mm-hmm. And so that's how my youth was spent.
In the car, driving to lessons.
Yes, or in the practice room.
Or in the practice room, right. Yeah, well, I think we could have guessed that. Not from your personality, but from your great skill. So then you became a composer as well.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, I think I always knew that this would happen. Okay. Especially because, it was so much sort of overwhelming experience to me to think about music writ large and how I wanted to be involved in it more than as a performer. It felt to me like more of a creative role that I needed to have in it. And so, I began writing music, in fact, when I was very, very young. Mm.
So you write in The Art of the Vibe that there is this idea that being engaged with difficult music or something esoteric, you say the esoteric, the difficult, and the rarefied. Mm-hmm. You use those three terms at one point. At what point did you start to identify with music that could be described that way? Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think early on, it was the only music I had access to. We didn't play popular music in my house. We just played classical music. Oh, okay. So I wasn't even exposed to anything other than classical music until I was and kind of very well formed, really.
Yeah.
And by that point, it felt so foreign to me that I kind of didn't even know what to do about it.
That makes a lot of sense. And I'm curious, too, because, again, in this essay, you're also talking about social structure, and you're thinking about that. And so to think back to that era as you're really coming into your own, and, I mean, it sounds like you were identifying as a musician from, the age of 4. But I think, we start to see ourselves in relation to the world a little bit more as teens and then in our early 20s and so on. Looking back, was there also a social sense of that mattered?
Absolutely. So I was homeschooled, so I didn't have a lot of contact with my peers growing up. And this was compounded by the fact that I was incredibly serious about music, so I would spend most of my time practicing. Right. So the idea of the urgency to have friends was probably much more on the back seat for me. And so, by the time I got to Eastman as an undergraduate at the age of 16, I had no clue how to relate to my peers. No clue. And, not only that, but I was like 2 years younger than all of my
16.
class, and so, not only was I this bizarre little know-it-all from nowhere, but I was also younger than everybody else. So I remember sitting in a theory class just being like, this is so exciting. I love it. It's amazing. And I wanted to answer every single question. And I hadn't had the experience in high school or grade school or whatever to know that, like, as soon as you do that, everybody's going to hate you.
Yeah, kind of.
So, there was that. And then at a certain point, I don't remember exactly when it was, but I began to think about this because I began to realize that people thought of me as a stuck-up, nose in the air jerk because I was driven and because and I think in a lot
Even at Eastman, even at a serious conservatory.
Yeah, I mean, when you think of the majority of kids, even though they've had deep, deep training in what they're doing, but the majority of them are coming from some sort of school system and have some formative experience with what that's like. Not only that, but they classical music isn't their only contact with music. They have usually quite a broad, and it's not like I absolutely hadn't heard anything else. But again, my contact with it was limited. It was like a store here, radio there, and again, you have to know that I was spending 4 to 8 hours practicing every day. So it's not like I was out in the mall, running around and doing stuff and encountering lots of stuff. So, at a certain point, and again, I can't put my finger on exactly when that happened, but I remember thinking to myself, okay, I've got to sort this out because, if I am going to be a human in this world, I need to learn a lot of different things. And so that involves a lot that, of course, the scope of this interview doesn't even have time to go into. But, in the musical zone of things, that also meant to try to expand my palette greatly. And not all of this was for social reasons, although some of it was. But much of it, too, was this sense in which I don't know exactly which part of this dawned on me first, but as it began to dawn on me that people viewed me as a kind of a stuck-up person, it also dawned on me that though I could come back and say, yeah, but it's not really a choice on my part. I just wasn't exposed. The truth of the matter is that there is a certain perception about classical music that doesn't come from nowhere. And so the idea that, in fact, there are certain, and I'll cut to the chase, economic significances attached to certain different types of music really makes one think about what the repercussions of involvement in one area or another might be.
So I just want to touch back to the beginning. The Lonesome Project is much more, I guess I would just say, accessible. And, having listened to some of your work prior to that over the past, 10 to 15 years, a lot of that does seem to be experimenting more with both rhythm and, melody and harmony, which makes it feel less accessible. So looking at all that, to me, it feels like Lonesome is a big shift. And the way you're describing it now seems like you've been thinking about a lot of those things for a long time. So I want to hear about the shift to lonesome, but if you could talk a little bit more about what you were thinking about leading up to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think that a huge part of my explorations kind of leading up to that involved different rabbit holes, going down different rabbit holes.
Okay.
So before that, predating it by a couple of years, was a project where I was writing stylistic counterpoint, meaning that I wanted to feel as though not only was I able to kind of understand the way that, let's say, 16th century polyphony was put together, but I could write it so convincingly that it would be like I had time warped myself.
Cool.
So I wrote this hybrid work that was somewhere between a book and an opera and I don't even know what. It's almost like it takes the premise of a counterpoint textbook and it turns it sort of on its head. So it has creative writing in it. It has sort of rebuttals to various theories in it. It has a lot in it. Throughout this work, there's these however many pieces there are, I forget, that drop into these different stylistic zones and deconstruct in a pretty brutal way all of the stuff that goes into that writing in a social sense as well as in just a historical sense. So what was the, political context surrounding the Age of Enlightenment, for example, or what was and how did that influence the way that we think about music, or what was happening in the 20th century when, suddenly we begin proliferating the leading tone to such an extent that we no longer hear a tonal center. What was the unrest going on? So there's it.
Can you tell me about maybe just one of those?
Yeah.
The Enlightenment, the early 20th century.
Sure. So in a lot of different ways, they're so interconnected that I kind of can't drop into just one. But
Feel free to connect them too.
Totally. So one of the interesting aspects that I wanted to explore is that there is this musician whose name was Johann Joseph Fuchs, who wrote a counterpoint manual that came out just right about at the time that Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier came out. So what's interesting about this is that Fuchs was trying to capture Palestrina-style counterpoint, which was a 16th century phenomenon. So we're talking about, his trying to codify what was going on pre-Reformation, really, in this 1723 manual on counterpoint. And for the first time, he broke the learning of counterpoint down in a step-by-step sort of process that not only, is incredibly clear, but also really tells you something very profound about the thinking around that period of time of like the democratization of knowledge, the scientific method. And not only is that in many ways very beautiful, it's also very problematic because it suggests that it's almost a two-way street. Like, okay, music composition is a step-by-step process, which it absolutely is not. And then from there, we can also look at that particular method of learning counterpoint, which became profoundly important to the classical composers, as being pivotal to Schenker's theory of analysis. And Schenker is a 20th century music theorist who comes to formulate this theory of tonal music, which is in equal parts elegant and problematic. But I don't think he could ever have formulated this theory had it not been for this kind of Fuchsian approach to counterpoint.
And would you also situate Schenker's theory in the socio-political context of the time?
And Schenker was incredibly problematic, not just musically, but also socially and politically. And
how so?
Well,
Nutshell.
He was a composer or music theorist and composer of German Jewish origin, and he came to have a very complicated and problematic relationship to his, not only his own Jewish roots, but the entire situation, which kind of in many ways tied his theory to some pretty problematic ways of thinking. And that was, by the way, it was not his fault. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
I mean, it gathered its own momentum, but he kind of started the ball rolling in that direction. So deeply problematic. And that wasn't the only problematic thing about him. A lot of it was that this very powerful theory gave him a basis to judge what was good, quote, good, end quote, in music. So, he had this kind of strange little swath of, it wasn't strange, it was very normal swath of repertoire that went from Bach through Brahms, who was the last composer that he sort of respected. Chopin was kind of, there were some exceptions there within Chopin's music, but, anything beyond that, he just considered to be basically garbage. Mm-hmm. So it was sort of like, it bears a very uncomfortable resemblance to a lot of thinking that puts people in a terrible position socially, right?
Right. We can think about it in terms of racial hierarchies
exactly.
in a big way.
Exactly. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Or the ways that there are composers in the 20th century who were writing music that was trying to push against their totalitarian political regimes and maybe was not something that Schenker would think was a legitimate form of music. Yeah.
And so when you think about it, particularly the timing of that and how, this is a person who's roughly contemporary to Schoenberg, who was condemned for degenerate art.
Can you just, for folks who don't know Schoenberg?
Yeah, Arnold Schoenberg.
He was the person who sort of really exploded tonality.
Yeah, in a lot of different ways. I think that the story is more complex for sure, but he's the person to whom we kind of credit the 12-tone system. So if you think about these two people as kind of roughly contemporary, and interestingly enough, both of them wrote counterpoint manuals and harmony manuals. And so, Schoenberg, as much of a composer as he was also deeply involved in the theory of music. But his perspective was a very different one.
Okay. This is, I think, helping give us the beginning of a sense of the connections between musical style and its social and political situation. And that's something that you were exploring in this Journey to the Underworld project. And did that lead then to this Appalachian folk set of songs?
Yeah, I did, in a funny way. I think part of the job of one being empathetic is really to try to get inside each thing. So the idea of just borrowing something, but basically staying centered within one's own perspective, can be troubling. That's essentially what colonization is. Instead, I would far much rather follow my curiosity in various different directions wholeheartedly, decenter myself each and every time, and then by doing so, be able to free myself of myself. It's not about me anyway. It's about the art, about the exploring of these different things. I oftentimes come back to this, that really my goal is not to find myself, it's to lose myself.
And did you lose yourself in Lonesome?
Yeah. I think every time I do a project that feels really saturated in whatever it is, I do feel as though it's no longer about me. And I think the dichotomy is that, or the contradiction or whatever it is that people will always say, and they're not wrong, this must be an incredibly deeply personal project. And it is. And yet it also goes far beyond that. A little bit like what I was talking about at Eastman, it began maybe as a project of me being a misfit, trying to just be socially acceptable. But after a while, the actual curiosity takes over and you no longer matter in it.
I wonder if you could talk about a particular song. I actually really enjoyed the title song.
Yeah, absolutely. I should also sort of preface this by saying one of the reasons that I fell into that project was that I was in the midst of writing a novel, and the first draft of that novel I was really experimenting with different sort of ways of playing with false quotations and funny things that could pop up, and as if somehow maybe this was a archive or maybe an academic text, or and I would quote things. So anyway, in the novel, what I did was I made up this fictitious folk singer, and I would quote lyrics from him, and they would head chapters.
Okay, and he's like a source in the novel. He's not a character.
No, he's not a character. And it was like, I made up his record label and put dates and little bits of information that you'd be like, whoa, is this actually a real, and I even made up, this guy's from Boone, North Carolina. I kind of made up a good deal about it. His name is Odell Sweetwillow.
That's good. I'm convinced.
Yeah. So anyway, the more that I got into looking at these little fake citations and all of that from Odell Sweetwillow, the more I thought, these are so cool. I really want to write the songs. So, I went out and got myself a banjo, and I'd never come into contact with a banjo before, but I thought, oh, this will be really, really fun. That'll be a frontier that I've never explored. That'll be cool to do that. And so, I remember that summer I got the banjo home, and I didn't even know that you were supposed to use the metal finger picks. I mean, you don't have to, but the Earl Scruggs style playing, right, you would. And so I kind of tried the claw hammer style for a minute, where you don't use the picks and you just kind of strum, and it's a wonderful rhythmic type of effect. But I don't know, something about the fact that I've played the harp for so many years, I just wanted to be able to have my fingers be somewhat independent.
Yeah.
So I went and I got the metal finger picks. I found my way around the fingerboard. I practiced. I really, as is typical for me, I went into that whole rabbit hole. I spent hours each day with the banjo, And so most of the songs that I wrote in the beginning were with the banjo.
Okay.
And most of them were kind of from this cheeky standpoint where I was kind of like, oh, I'm not really being earnest about this.
Yeah.
But the more I got involved, the more I thought, well, okay, fine. And yet, this is genuinely an interesting and also an amazing style of music, and the fact that, okay, so if I am trying to position Odell Sweetwillow in kind of an Appalachian place, what is that lineage? And you have all of this sort of Scotch-Irish immigrants and their music, and Italian immigrants and their music, and music from Black musicians. And so you have so many different influences coming into this music. And so that provided an enormous variety of things to explore in there. And so the more I explored, the more serious I got about it. And again, it started to be bigger.
That's great. I love that it started as this kind of false archive and then became this actual real album and exploration of the music.
Yeah, and I think what was cool about it too was the more I played around with making songs, the more I thought engaging with that craft, which is a different craft than other music making practices, it became very gratifying. It became, in the same way, like a beautiful, overwhelming thing. Again, that sensation, of just it washing over you and it being amazing and dancing with it and all of that. So, and I must say, I think that's my obsession with craft in general, is that very sort of like, if I can, I hate the word master it, but if I can become comfortable enough with it, if I can become fluent enough with it to dance, that is the most pleasurable experience I can possibly imagine, bar none. So, that kind of did it for me.
That makes so much sense. That's great. I'm curious, and we should wrap up because I should let you go. But I do just want to ask, is it all about craft and form, or is there still an element of exploring something that you're thinking about and feeling as you're making these things?
I think it's all wrapped up in one big ball.
Okay.
I think we all come from the standpoint of our own set of feelings and emotions and experiences. We're all just an amalgam of that. So in a way, if Lonesome starts with my own pain, that's jumping off point. But it doesn't stop there. All my edges going
weak. Gabriel Jenks is an associate professor of music composition at the Jacobs School of Music. We're listening to the title track of his new album, Lonesome. For Nice Work, I'm Alex Chambers.
If I was lonesome, I'd turn around and let you see what the lake had found. I don't know what you do or say. I'd be afraid you'd walk away. 'Cause I got wounds I best not show 'em here.